The rhythmic, maddening scrape vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up the legs of the bed and settling directly into the base of Rhiannon's skull. It was a dull, heavy friction, like a massive oak dresser being relentlessly dragged across uneven hardwood. Beneath that agonizing friction thumped the muffled, booming bass of a television cranked to an ungodly volume, broadcasting the indistinct, synthetic cheer of a late-night infomercial. Rhiannon stared at the popcorn ceiling of her second-floor apartment, the digital clock on her nightstand bleeding a harsh crimson 2:14 a.m. across the dark room. Her teeth ached from clenching her jaw. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the palms of her hands against her ears, but the noise wasn't just airborne, it was structural. It lived in the bones of the building, and tonight it was going to break her. Rhiannon had moved into Unit 304 of the bleak, brutalist apartment complex 8 months prior, driven by necessity rather than choice. The rent was cheap, primarily because the building was managed by Thuron, a notoriously ruthless property manager who treated his tenants like disposable cattle. Thuron was a man who turned the boiler off in February to save pennies, who towed tenants' cars if their tires brushed the painted lines of the parking lot, and who had personally orchestrated the illegal eviction of Rhiannon's elderly neighbor just weeks before. Everyone in the building lived in a state of quiet, resentful terror under Thuron's thumb, everyone except the ghost in Unit 204. For the first few weeks, Rhiannon had barely noticed the tenant directly beneath her. But soon the nocturnal symphony began. It was never party noise. There were no clinking bottles, no raucous laughter, no thumping bass lines of terrible music. It was always the television, dialed up so high that Rhiannon could make out the distinct cadence of news anchors and canned laughter through her carpet. And then, without fail, around 11 o'clock, the dragging would start. It sounded like immense dead weight being pulled from the living room, down the narrow hallway, and into the bathroom. Rhiannon despised confrontation. The mere thought of knocking on a stranger's door and demanding quiet made her throat constrict with anxiety. She didn't want to be the difficult neighbor, the complainer, the one who caused trouble. So she endured it. She bought silicone earplugs. She ran a box fan on its highest setting. She swallowed her frustration and poured extra shots of espresso into her morning thermos. But this particular Tuesday night was a breaking point. She had a massive financial review at her accounting firm the next morning, a presentation that dictated whether she kept her job or joined the unemployment line. The dragging downstairs had been going on for hours, pausing only to be replaced by the violent, echoing thud of something heavy striking the floor. The television was practically screaming. Throwing off her duvet, Rhiannon marched into the kitchen, her bare feet slapping against the cold linoleum. She grabbed a legal pad and a ballpoint pen. Her hand trembled with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline as she drafted the note. She rewrote it 3 times, desperately trying to strike a balance between firm boundary setting and polite diplomacy. "Hi neighbor," she finally wrote, her cursive sharp and hurried. "I live directly above you in 304. I'm not sure if you're aware, as these floors are incredibly thin, but the volume of your television comes through very loudly at night. Also, there's a frequent sound of heavy furniture being moved late in the evening. I have to be up very early for work and it's been making sleep impossible. Could we maybe figure something out? I'd really appreciate it." She folded the yellow paper in half, marched down the dimly lit, carpeted stairwell, and stood before the heavy faux wood door of Unit 204. She could hear the television blaring inside, a crime documentary, judging by the dramatic narration. Holding her breath, she knelt and slid the paper beneath the door sweep. She practically sprinted back upstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, terrified the door would fly open and she would be met with screaming hostility. 3 agonizing days passed. The silence from downstairs was absolute, but the anticipation of retaliation gnawed at Rhiannon's nerves. She half expected to find her car keyed or a furious eviction warning taped to her door from Thuron, assuming the neighbor had complained to management about her harassment. Then on Friday morning, as she was rushing out the door with her briefcase, she stepped on something. A thick, cream-colored envelope rested perfectly centered on her welcome mat. Rhiannon picked it up, her stomach twisting into a tight knot. The handwriting on the envelope was meticulous, written in dark fountain pen ink. She tore it open, bracing herself for a barrage of insults. "Dear Rhiannon," the letter began, "my name is Garrick. I cannot apologize enough for the disturbance. I am entirely deaf in my left ear following an industrial accident some years ago, and my right ear is rapidly deteriorating. I genuinely had absolutely no idea the television was echoing through the floorboards. I have already ordered a specialized Bluetooth soundbar that will allow me to route the audio directly into a headset at night. As for the moving of things, I am currently organizing my late brother's estate and lost track of time. I will ensure all sorting is done during daylight hours. Rhiannon let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 days. The tension melted from her shoulders, replaced by a profound, heavy guilt. She had spent months agonizing over a villain who didn't exist, constructing a narrative of a careless, selfish jerk when the reality was a grieving man struggling with a disability. But it was the final paragraph that cemented the interaction in her mind. Most importantly, Garrick had written, "Thank you for coming to me directly." Most people would have gone straight to Thuron to complain without giving me a chance to fix it. Thuron has been looking for any excuse to throw me out onto the street. Your kindness in handling this quietly means more than you know. Rhiannon stood in her hallway, reading the thick parchment twice over. The sincerity radiated from the ink. It was a stark reminder of the humanity hiding behind closed doors. Sometimes, being the person who leaves the polite note actually just works. She slipped the letter into her purse, a warm sense of resolution washing over her. For the next week, the apartment was a sanctuary. The heavy dragging ceased entirely. The booming bass of the television was replaced by an ambient, peaceful silence. Rhiannon slept through the night, aced her presentation, and felt the dark clouds of exhaustion finally lift. The situation was completely resolved. Until the following Tuesday, when Rhiannon awoke not to the sound of moving furniture, but to the harsh, strobing glare of red and blue lights painting her bedroom ceiling. She threw on a heavy cardigan and stepped out onto her balcony. The parking lot was swarming with police cruisers. Yellow crime scene tape was being unspooled across the entrance to the leasing office on the ground floor. A cold dread pooled in Rhiannon's stomach as she watched a pair of uniformed officers kick in the door to Thuron's private apartment behind the office. By noon, the entire building was buzzing with the news. Thuron was gone. Not just absent, but vanished under circumstances that had the authorities tearing up the floorboards of his office. Rumors spread like wildfire through the drafty hallways. Some said he had absconded with a massive sum of embezzled security deposits. Others whispered that the state of his office, a shattered glass desk, overturned filing cabinets, and a massive dark stain soaking into the cheap commercial carpet, pointed to a violent end. Rhiannon sat at her kitchen island, staring blankly at a cooling cup of coffee. Thuron was a monster, a man who had ruined countless lives, including her own mother's before she passed. But the violence of his disappearance left an unsettling chill in the air. There was a heavy knock on her door. She opened it to find a weary-looking man in a rumpled suit, holding a leather notepad. "Rhiannon Vance?" he asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Detective Costas, I'm speaking with all the residents. Mind if I ask you a few questions about your landlord?" Rhiannon invited him in. Costas paced her small living room, asking about Thuron's habits, his enemies, any suspicious activity she might have noticed. "He had a lot of enemies," Rhiannon said carefully, clutching her coffee mug. "He wasn't a good man, detective. He threatened people, he ruined them financially." "We're aware," Costas grunted, jotting something down. "We're trying to establish a precise timeline. We believe whatever happened to Thuron occurred late last Tuesday night. Between midnight and 3 in the morning. Did you hear anything unusual, shouting, the sound of a struggle?" The mug slipped slightly in Rhiannon's grasp, the ceramic clinking sharply against her wedding ring. Last Tuesday night. The exact night she had reached her breaking point. The exact night she had stormed downstairs. "No," Rhiannon lied, her voice completely steady despite the sudden, roaring rush of blood in her ears. "I'm a very heavy sleeper." Costas thanked her and left, leaving Rhiannon standing frozen in the center of her apartment. The puzzle pieces, jagged and horrific, began to snap together in her mind with sickening clarity. She walked slowly to her bedroom, standing precisely over the spot where the noise had always been the loudest. Garrick's note, "Organizing my late brother's estate, lost track of time." The television cranked to an ear-splitting volume. Not because he was deaf, but because he needed to drown out the sound of a violent, desperate struggle. The heavy dragging. It wasn't an oak dresser. It wasn't boxes of old belongings. It was dead weight. 190 pounds of dead weight being pulled from the living room, down the narrow hallway, and into the bathroom, where the bathtub was. Thuron hadn't vanished into thin air. He had been dragged through the very floorboards beneath Rhiannon's feet. Garrick's gratitude for her not going to management took on a terrifying, brilliant new context. "Thank you for not going to Thuron. How could she?" Thuron was already dead, bleeding out on the linoleum directly beneath her bed, while she was angrily drafting a polite noise complaint. By leaving that note, she hadn't just avoided an argument. She had inadvertently tipped Garrick off that his cover noise was too loud, allowing him to adjust his methods before the rest of the building noticed. She had given a killer the feedback he needed to perfect his crime. A wave of nausea washed over her. She needed air. Rhiannon grabbed her keys and hurried out of the apartment, taking the stairs down to the basement laundry room to splash cold water on her face from the utility sink. The basement was dimly lit, smelling of damp concrete and old lint. As she rounded the corner toward the washing machines, she froze. Garrick was standing by the industrial trash chute. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded gray sweater. In his gloved hands, he held a massive, heavy-duty black contractor bag. The thick plastic strained against whatever dense, jagged contents were packed inside. He looked up. Their eyes met. The silence in the basement was absolute save for the distant hum of the boiler. The overwhelming, stinging scent of industrial bleach hung thickly in the air, burning the inside of Rhiannon's nose. Garrick didn't panic. He didn't drop the bag. He merely stood there, his dark eyes locked onto hers, analyzing the micro-expressions on her pale face. He saw the realization dawn in her eyes. He saw her glance at the strained plastic of the bag, then back to his face. Slowly, deliberately, Garrick smiled. It wasn't a malicious grin, but a gentle, almost sorrowful expression. "Good morning, Rhiannon," he said, his voice deep and calm, lacking any trace of the deafness he had claimed. "I was just taking out the last of my brother's things. It's amazing, isn't it? How much peace a little quiet brings to a home." He hoisted the heavy bag, the contents shifting with a wet, heavy crunch, and shoved it down the steel chute. It echoed violently as it plummeted into the subterranean dumpster below. Rhiannon's mind raced. She could run. She could scream for Detective Costas, who was likely still canvassing the third floor. She could point to the bleach, to the trash chute, to the man standing before her. But then she remembered the eviction notice Thuron had gleefully slapped on her mother's door 3 days before Christmas. She remembered the stress that had triggered her mother's fatal stroke. She remembered the countless families Thuron had crushed beneath his expensive leather shoes. Garrick pulled off his thick rubber gloves, folding them neatly. "I meant what I said in my letter," he added softly, stepping toward the stairwell. "You're a good neighbor, the kind who understands that some problems are best solved directly, without involving the authorities." He left the basement, his footsteps echoing up the concrete stairs. Rhiannon stood alone in the chemical-scented dampness. She walked over to the utility sink, turning the rusted handle. The cold water rushed over her trembling hands. She stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror above the basin. The horror had faded, replaced by a strange, icy calm. When she returned to the ground floor lobby, Detective Costas was standing by the main entrance, buttoning his trench coat. He spotted her and walked over. "Miss Vance, one last thing," Costas said, pulling out his notepad. "We're trying to clear the residence on the second floor. Do you know the man in 204, Garrick?" Rhiannon looked past the detective's shoulder. Garrick was standing just inside the doorway of his apartment down the hall, holding the door open by an inch. He was watching her. Waiting. "Yes," Rhiannon said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I know him. Did you see or hear him on Tuesday night?" Rhiannon smiled politely at the detective. "Actually, yes, I have terrible insomnia. Garrick and I were awake late that night. I went down to his apartment around midnight and we had a cup of tea. We were talking until nearly 3 in the morning. It was completely quiet. He's a wonderful neighbor." Costas clicked his pen, jotting down the alibi. "Good to know. Thank you for your time, Miss Vance." The detective walked out the glass doors into the chilly morning air. Rhiannon turned her head. Down the hallway, Garrick slowly closed his door, the metallic click of the deadbolt echoing through the corridor. The building was finally quiet. And as Rhiannon walked back up the stairs to her sanctuary, she realized that sometimes true justice isn't found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's served in the dead of night, dragged across a hardwood floor, and sealed with a polite note from a neighbor who understands the profound value of silence. We often go through our days assuming the worst about the strangers living right beside us. We build monsters out of mild inconveniences, forgetting that everyone is fighting battles or settling scores that we know nothing about. Sometimes extending a hand of polite communication doesn't just resolve a conflict. It might just make you an accomplice to the perfect revenge. If this story kept you awake and listening to the floorboards, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share your own crazy neighbor stories in the comments below. You never know who might be listening.